In an attack that will have been personally authorized by President Obama, the US has confirmed it targeted and killed al-Qaeda's second-in-command in a drone strike in Pakistan. And more than 30 others have been killed in 3 days of such attacks. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. When President Obama was elected in 2008, his predecessor, George W. Bush's global war on terror, was renamed as an overseas contingency operation. But while the rhetoric has been less incendiary, far from abandoning the tactics of the Bush years, Obama has intensified the ferocity of attacks on America's enemies. Under the command of the man who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, the use of unmanned drone attacks has surged. And according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, so has the number of civilians killed. What's more, a New York Times article has revealed that the president personally approves or vetoes each drone strike after consulting closely with security officials. There is no direct risk to American military personnel, but critics, including the Pakistani government, point out that the drone strikes are imprecise and violate the sovereignty of the countries they strike. So, can America's reliance on drone strikes be justified? We're joined by Scott Shane, national security reporter for the New York Times. He co-authored that piece on President Obama's secret kill list. Clifford May is a former director of communications for the Republican National Committee and is president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Also with us, Ray McGovern. He served as a security analyst with the CIA for over 25 years. Ray McGovern, clearly the killing of al-Libi, if it is completely confirmed then, will help those who argue that this isn't a war of the US is choosing, but it is a just war and it's working against America's enemies. What would you respond to that?
Well, yes, and I'm sure all the other people killed with him were military-age males. The question is, we never know who else was killed in these strikes. And for the number 2 in al-Qaeda, my best source is Stephen Colbert, who had a wonderful session last week on how many number 2s in al-Qaeda we have killed and how difficult it is to get applications for that position now.
Nonetheless, though, Scott Shane, wouldn't you say that this latest killing will help the White House make its case, or at least in their minds it'll make that case? Clearly your reporting on the secret kill list had White House approval. They think this is a winning argument in an election year.
Yeah, I think in general for most American voters, probably the idea of getting tough on al-Qaeda, going off after them in Pakistan and Yemen is a popular thing. I guess I should also say that the administration's argument is that if you accept the idea that the United States government is going to try to kill members of al-Qaeda, that by comparison with how we tried it in Afghanistan and Iraq, meaning sending 100,000 troops in for a 10-year invasion, or as we did in Vietnam, fly over and drop just tons and tons of bombs, that this drone technology, while it may seem creepy to some people and may kill, probably does kill certainly some civilians, they would argue that this is the most precise and humane way to take out the terrorists.
The problem being there that we don't really know who's being killed.
Well, exactly. I mean, these are mostly in the tribal areas of Pakistan and Yemen, very rough territory where reporters generally cannot go. And so to know exactly who's been killed and who has been accidentally killed as collateral damage is sometimes very difficult to tell.
Clifford May, I mean, is there a sense then that in some ways the administration rather likes the revulsion of progressives and those who don't agree with this manner of fighting a war on terror, and they kind of are using it in this election year?
I don't think they like the revulsion of progressives. I think there's obviously a political component. A story like this, I think among the things it's meant to do is to show the American voting populace, not least the independents, that they have in the White House somebody who's being very tough on terrorism. There is a political component, but of course it's an election year. You can't take the politics out of politics, and everything is political. So while I'm critical, I'm not overly critical of that fact. But there are 2 points that I think do need to be brought into the discussion. One is, and this I am critical on, drones are a weapon. Drones are not a strategy. You're not going to destroy al-Qaeda, the ideology on which it rests, and other groups as well, simply through the use of drones. And the time the president is spending on kill lists, as Scott has very ably demonstrated in his reporting, we're talking about almost 100 since the death of Osama bin Laden. That's time he's not spending on an overarching strategy to defeat America's enemies. I think that's very important. I do want to take one exception on this. If al-Qaeda operatives are embedding themselves among civilian population, they bear the bulk of the responsibility for the deaths of civilians, not us for having killed them. Secondly, I would say you have to figure these guys are surrounding themselves with people who know who they are. And if you kill a driver or a cook or another servant to an al-Qaeda commander, is that really a civilian? I'm not saying mistakes may not be made. They probably have been and are. But let's not overdo that.
All right, there's a lot to unpack there, and we will do that in a few moments. But Ray McGovern, first of all, though, by and large, hasn't most of President Obama's liberal base signed on to this? They seem to be quite fine with some of these arguments that we're hearing.
Well, I would have to say that I've witnessed a kind of a boiling frog syndrome here, where even some progressives are just so inured to this or that chipping away at what we used to consider to be legal and moral principles, that there isn't the outcry that there should be. Now, the conundrum described by Scott Shane is, how do you square, how do you align, is the word, this kind of activity with American legal and moral principles? Well, you can't, okay? Now, they get the lawyers like John Ashcroft or Gonzalez or Mukasey, and they'll say, yeah, you can do that, Mr. President, just like the fellow who told George Bush he could torture. So that's taken care of. But what about the moral? The way they justify, in quotes, the moral is they serve up John Brennan, whom I know.
The counterterrorism advisor.
Yeah, and he's both tough, and he's described as almost a priest, kind of a person who has such rigid...
His moral rectitude was discussed, actually, in Scott's article.
Yeah, and he's the fellow that said exactly a year ago that we didn't kill any. There wasn't one collateral murder, collateral whatever you want to call it, in almost the previous year. Well, that's preposterous. That's against all belief. And so if this is the moral code, this is the moral priest that's advising Obama at his side at every decision, that doesn't convince me.
Very quickly, let's just remind ourselves as to how far the drone strikes have intensified under President Obama. Clearly, hard and fast numbers on strikes are very difficult to come by, but the Bureau of Investigative Journalism estimates 409 drone strikes have been carried out under the Obama administration, killing at least 2,114 people. Compare that with 53 drone strikes carried out under the administration of George W. Bush, killing at least 438. And Scott Shane, that was so interesting that this idea of a just war seemed to be very important to those making these decisions. Again, John Brennan likened to a priest. President Obama's studies of Thomas Aquinas were discussed. This idea that clearly you don't want war, but in some circumstances there is a moral. There is some sort of moral argument for that, a desire to align the war with U.S. values and so forth. Is that really how they see it, how the people you spoke to saw it?
They certainly talk in those terms, and I think when you look at President Obama, he famously denounced the Iraq War, and that was one reason he's president today. So I think people have tended to think of him as a liberal, as a law professor. What they may have missed is that in August of 2007, in the major national security speech of his campaign for president, he actually made a somewhat different point. He said essentially that he wanted to pull out of Iraq, he wanted to end the war in Afghanistan, and he wanted to focus the war or the military action on a very narrow target, which is al-Qaeda. In other words, he saw the invasion of Iraq as a bad idea, a complete distraction, and he wanted to refocus on al-Qaeda. And he actually said, it made a bit of a splash even in 2007, that if Pakistan would not go after bin Laden or others hiding in Pakistan, that under his presidency he would. he was ridiculed for that. I think people saw it as sort of a greenhorn's mistake. He was ridiculed by Mitt Romney, who was then a presidential candidate, Hillary Clinton, who was one of Obama's rivals for the Democratic nomination, and Joe Biden, who was another rival. They all said, you know, this is silly. You can't just go take military action willy-nilly in Pakistan.
But that's more of an argument then about American exceptionalism. It's not about Thomas Aquinas or morality and so forth. I mean, we understand that the strikes on Sunday, for example, were attacking mourners, a funeral procession for what some of those killed in previous strikes. Again, you have to wonder how that, if this idea of morality is so uppermost in their minds, how they're dealing with all of this.
Well, you know, it's so hard, as you noted, to get sort of the ground truth on this subject. This is technically in Pakistan a covert action program, which is supposed to be the highest level of secrecy that the government has. But they have sort of recognized that when things blow up on the ground and people are killed, that it's certainly not a secret from those down on the ground. And so they have reached this kind of awkward compromise of letting out, you know, answering some questions on an anonymous basis, having people like John Brennan, the counterterrorism advisor, and others give speeches where they explain, at least to some degree, what they believe is the legal basis for this. But it's interesting that this whole campaign of strikes has never been debated publicly by Congress because technically it remains a secret.
President Obama did address the drone strikes during a video conference on the social networking site Google Plus in January, and he was asked about the increase of drone strikes under his presidency, whether the loss of civilian life was worth it for U.S. interests. Here's how he responded.
I want to make sure that people understand actually drones have not caused a huge number of civilian casualties. For the most part, they have been very precise, precision strikes against al-Qaeda and their affiliates. It is important for everybody to understand that this thing is kept on a very tight leash. It's not a bunch of folks in a room somewhere just making decisions.
Actually, interestingly, Scott Shane's reporting of the New York Times suggests it is actually a bunch of people in a room making decisions. And certainly this idea of civilian casualties being low may be true under what we now understand as President Obama's definition of enemy combatants. All military-aged males in a strike zone are placed in that category unless it's otherwise proven posthumously. In that recent New York Times article co-authored by Scott, unnamed former senior intelligence officials criticized the White House civilian death estimates. One said, quote, "It bothers me when they say there were 7 guys, so they must all be militants. They count the corpses and they're not really sure who they are." Clifford May, is there that sense then that President Obama, with his liberal credentials, has been allowed to intensify the Bush administration's policies, not just on this, but also on various other war on terror type policies? You know, he could just say, "Look, trust me, I'm the liberal law professor."
Well, that's true, and I think there is some hypocrisy one can see here. Imagine if Scott had written exactly the same piece about the moral, legal, and martial journeys of Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, how, with great reluctance, after studying Thomas Aquinas, they decided that enhanced interrogation was necessary and they would do so. Imagine the uproar we'd hear now that well beyond anything that Scott has heard. I know he's heard some. That said, I think Obama should be answering questions and speaking about this, and much more than he has, communicating why he thinks it's a necessity. I would also, Shihab, say to you, Al-Qaeda, we know, is an organization that has a great deal of operational security. The idea that they are surrounding themselves, wherever they're based, with people who are absolutely civilians, have no idea where they are or what they're doing, and that they allow these people. A funeral for an Al-Qaeda leader is probably going to be attended by people who are not unsympathetic to Al-Qaeda's
also
purposes.
A lot of women and children, people who probably, you know, just...
If you are the wife of an Al-Qaeda commander, and you stay with your commander in the battle zone, you do put yourself at some risk and danger. If you go to work for Al-Qaeda, you put yourself at some risk from Al-Qaeda. The idea that we should say, as long as they surround themselves with women and children, we can't do anything to them, it'll be our moral responsibility, not theirs. One more point is, we don't have to guess at the morality in this, or we shouldn't have to. After all, as you know, and as we've discussed, President Bush had memos written by the Justice Department saying what you may and may not do in terms of interrogation. They were derided as the torture memos, though I would argue they were don't torture members. They said where the line is between enhanced interrogation and torture. You can disagree, but a line was drawn. There are, I would assume, and Scott can tell us, similar memos prepared by the Justice Department about the use of drones. Obama made Bush's memos public. I would think it would be consistent for him to make his memos public so we could discuss the legal and moral issues that the attorneys at the Justice Department have grappled with.
Scott, what did you find out about internal legal memos and that sort of thing?
Well, we actually at the New York Times have, I filed and a colleague filed some Freedom of Information Act requests for those memos over the last couple of years. They were refused. They refused to give us the memos, and so we actually are in court right now fighting with the Obama administration over whether a judge will order them to make public some of those memos. There is, as Cliff suggests, a kind of inconsistency. President Obama, in his first months in office, against the advice of 6 former CIA directors, decided to make public the Bush-era memos on interrogation, legal memos on interrogation. Mm-hmm. And yet, despite a lot of calls, including from some people inside the administration, we're told, he has not made the same decision about his own legal memos.
All right, so Ray McGovern, what are we to make of this then, that this administration believes that all military-aged males are guilty by definition if they are in a certain area in the strike zone, that it's sufficient to have the possibility of posthumous absolution as a safeguard against the wrong people being targeted, and that, as far as they're concerned, due process is being done through secret deliberations and memos from Justice Department lawyers and so forth.
Well, that's a canard about a due process. Now, Eric Holder, the Attorney General, tried to put a fine point on due process, which is in the Fifth Amendment to our Constitution. And he said, well, it doesn't mean judicial process. No, we can do the process right here in the White House. Okay? We'll do process.
The Constitution didn't specify.
Right here. Well, everyone up until now has known that to be a judicial process. What I'd like to do is to turn away from the legalities, which in my view, it's clearly, especially when you're talking about U.S. citizens, that's a violation pure and simple of the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. So legalities aside, morality aside, doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense. There is no one that will tell you that this will do anything other than make a lot of people angry. A backlash will come back, and everybody who's been killed will have an extended family of 100 people who will inevitably, at some point, get access to this country.
Not least the former director of National Intelligence, Dennis Blair, who wrote an article in op-ed.
One other thing about lists, okay? I know about lists, all right? I know about the list that was given to the Indonesian government about members of the Communist Party. 1 million of the people on that list given to them by the CIA were murdered. I know about the list in the Dominican Republic in 1965. I was on that task force. We needed to find other communists there, and 53 people were put on a list because they had lunch with a known or suspected communist. These lists are very, very fungible, okay? And the problem is, however accurate the Hellfire missiles are, and they are very accurate, it all depends on the targeting information, and that is notoriously unreliable.
Clifford May, the Pakistani Foreign Ministry called in the U.S. Deputy Ambassador on Tuesday, we understand. They said that the drone strikes were unlawful, against international law, and a violation of Pakistan's sovereignty. Can any of that be refuted?
It probably can be, because we are talking about places like Waziristan, which are ungoverned territories. And this gets back to, I think, to the point I was making, that we need more than drones. We need a strategy for fighting this war, and we need to decide what we're going to do about failed states, ungoverned spaces, places where terrorists have established bases and are unchallenged. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. And by the way, I think the Pakistani reaction is more complicated than their public pronouncements. I think there is a tacit approval from Pakistan in this case. I think there's at least that from Yemen. Somalia, again, you have a lot of ungoverned spaces. I do want to make a point on the legal aspects, because I think they are important. And first, that is to say that due process means the process that is due. And the process due a combatant is not the same as the process due somebody who holds up a 7-Eleven. However, and this is maybe the most important piece of news that I think comes out of this, the use of drones by this administration and the revelations that Scott has come up with surely puts an end to the debate over whether a criminal justice template can be imposed upon this conflict. A missile is the process due an enemy combatant, not a defendant in a criminal trial.
Obama sidestepped the issue of where and how to detain enemy combatants by killing them, frankly.
Well, that's also an important point. He is not detaining them, which means he is not interrogating them, and I would rather see an enemy combatant, an al-Qaeda member, detained and interrogated, including through harsh methods, so we get that intelligence which we need, than killed. What's more, I think if you had a choice today between being al-Libi, who we believe was just killed, or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is getting 3 square meals a day, exercising in a 1-acre soccer yard and reading the Quran and any other books he wants, if I were Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, my bumper sticker would be, I'd rather be waterboarding.
Ray McGovern, you might want to respond to that very quickly, though.
And enjoy yourself.
Well, I have to say that the conversation has pretty much devolved into one of a conversation that I never would have imagined could be possible just 10 years ago. We didn't used to torture. We didn't used to use enhanced interrogation techniques. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, evil though he may be, is entitled to due process. And when I come back to American citizens, I think it's unambiguous and it's unassailable, the fact that the president arrogating to himself the power to kill an American citizen without trial, without charge, without anything else, is not only extra-constitutional, but for those of us who have sworn a solemn oath to protect and defend the Constitution, we are in a quandary as to how we should react to this, and we don't think that we can react in silence.
Do you think there is a discussion amongst serving members of the military about this, then?
There's a big discussion among retired members of the military, including myself.
So does that extend then to serving members, do you think?
We're not, I can't really be sure of that. I think I've heard they have.
Scott, Shane, then what about this issue then that clearly the Obama administration has decided on drones, of limited strikes, on covert proxy wars and so forth, but is there any real discussion about a long-term strategy, whether this is in fact making everything worse, the risk of blowback, the sort of things again that Dennis Blair, the former director of national intelligence, spelled out after he left the administration?
Yes, Dennis Blair is I guess you could say, the most prominent former insider who has really had grave qualms that he's publicly expressed about this program. You know, his point is partly that drones have become themselves a radicalizing factor, a recruitment tool for militant groups like Al-Qaeda. And so you do have to ask yourself, when someone like Faisal Shahzad, the man who tried to blow up Times Square with a car bomb in 2010, says in court that it was the drone strikes that radicalized him, blames this program. You know, it certainly has caused disquiet inside the administration, and there have been a lot of conversations about long-term plans. I think the problem with longer-term solutions to this problem is they're very, very difficult. They often involve years, lots of money, acts of Congress, whereas a strike against a guy like Abu Yahya al-Libi, the guy who was announced dead today, really just requires, you know, an order and a few seconds and a missile strike. So the missile strikes continue, and the broader strategy, you know, is sort of lagging behind.
One other question, Scott, then perhaps we can answer. Since your revelations then that the administration is suggesting that all military-aged males in the strike zone are considered to be combatants, is the New York Times now being more careful about who they say are being killed in these drone strikes? I mean, it's always been a shorthand. I think I see the Associated Press today were quite happy to keep on saying alleged militants killed over the last few days, but now we know what those allegations are based on. As journalists, and in the New York Times, in fact, are they being more careful now about calling these people alleged militants, given that we know that the criteria basically means that just means you're a man or you're you know, or an adult?
Well, once again, I mean, you know, I guess I should elaborate and simply say that it's that counting method is not as absurd as it might seem when it's presented that way. What they would say is that they have a very good view from these drones. There are no people aboard the drones, so they can loiter over an area for hours or even days. identify a terrorist training compound or a bomb making
Right, but a
factory.
funeral or indeed neighbouring. I mean, we've
Yeah.
had, when people have gone back
Well-
and looked and say in Yemen, especially most recently, we found that, enormous amounts of quote collateral damage, which was
in the
initially
first strike in
denied and
Yemen.
lied about actually by the U.S. administration.
In the first strike in Yemen, it caused huge problems because I think there were about 40 women and children
Right.
killed.
And the
But
administration denied, first of all, that they were even involved in it, and then denied that there are any women and children involved. So it's very difficult then, isn't it?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think as a journalist, the problem you have is that if you are on the ground over there or you're in Pakistan, generally you're listening to security officials of one country or another, either Pakistan or the U.S., and if they tell you 7 militants were killed, that's all you have to go on to start with. But you're absolutely right that we probably should build some greater uncertainty in our reporting on these things.
Scott Chain, thank you very much for joining us. Scott Chain of the New York Times. Clifford May, thank you. Ray McGovern, thank you as well. And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.